Well, joining us now is Mark McCann, who's a former stock car racer, now has a YouTube channel on all things cars. You know loads about this.
Imagine spending more than $1 million on a Bugatti Veyron, only to discover that the car is not even sitting in one complete piece. Parts are spread across different garages. The gearbox needs major work. The body has problems. The interior is aged, and some of the beautiful carbon-looking pieces are not even real carbon fiber. Now imagine spending years bringing that machine back to life, only to face one final test, taking it back to the very company that transformed it in the first place. That is exactly the situation Mark McCann found himself in with his unusual Mansory modified Bugatti Veyron. Mark had already taken on the kind of project most people would never touch, but rebuilding the car was only part of the story. Once the Veyron was finally looking like a proper hypercar again, Mark wanted answers from the people who understood this particular machine better than almost anyone else. He took the car back to Mansory, the famous company behind its wild transformation, and even had the chance to meet Mansory himself. This was not just another stop at a car workshop. Mark wanted to know what the people responsible for the original design would think after seeing the car years later, especially after everything it had been through. Would they praise the rebuild? Would they find problems Mark had missed? Or would they tell him that one of the biggest changes he had been considering could actually hurt the car? The story becomes even more interesting because this Veyron is not a normal example of Bugatti history. It started life as a standard Veyron before Mansory transformed it in 2008, with the goal of giving it the look and character of the rare Pur Sang model. The transformation involved major exterior work and extensive carbon fiber additions, creating a car that sits somewhere between a factory Veyron and a highly customized collector car. That unusual identity also creates a difficult question about value. It is not a genuine Pur Sang, but it is not an untouched factory Veyron either. For a collector, that can make the car fascinating, but it can also make its true value harder to judge. Mark reportedly paid around $1.22 million for the car, but the purchase price was only the beginning. When he first inspected the Veyron, the reality of the project became clear. The car had been sitting disassembled for years, with pieces stored in different places. It was not simply waiting for a little repair work. It needed serious attention before it could become a usable hypercar again. A major gearbox problem alone created a huge financial challenge, while other issues included timing problems, missing hardware, damaged aluminum panels, and an interior that needed restoration. Even the exterior had surprises. Some areas that looked like carbon fiber were actually vinyl wrap, and that wrap had also seen better days. The deeper Mark went into the project, the more complicated it became. Early estimates suggested that the complete restoration could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, with the worst-case bill potentially reaching around $750,000. That meant Mark could have close to $1.9 million invested in the Veyron by the time everything was finished. At that point, the car had become much more than an expensive purchase. It was a massive gamble, a difficult engineering project, and a test of whether a heavily modified Veyron could still make financial and emotional sense. Yet Mark continued. After years of work, the car finally reached a point where he could think about something beyond simply making it run. He wanted to preserve what made the Veyron special, and that meant going back to Mansory. The visit would eventually reveal something Mark did not expect. Instead of simply celebrating the finished car, Mansory focused on one of its most unusual features, the bare polished aluminum exterior. The surface looked incredible, but it had a serious problem. After being polished, the aluminum will begin to develop a cloudy oxidation effect again within only a few hours. Mark had considered wrapping the car in red to hide the problem, but Mansory strongly advised against that idea. In his view, covering the original aluminum could damage the character and possibly the value of such a special car. That advice changed the direction of the project. Mark still needed a way to protect the aluminum, but now he had to find a solution that would preserve the original design instead of hiding it. The team could consider options such as anodizing, protective lacquer, or paint protection film, but there was no simple guarantee that one method would permanently solve the problem. Fortunately, Mansory had kept spare panels in the car for 18 years, giving Mark a chance to test possible solutions without risking the original pieces. That detail alone shows how unusual this Veyron really is. Mark had not simply bought an old supercar and repaired it. He had taken ownership of a piece of automotive history that required careful decisions at almost every step. And after everything he'd gone through, the visit to Mansory gave him something even more valuable than another repair, a better understanding of why preserving the car mattered. The man behind the original transformation was telling him not to hide one of the features that made the Veyron special. For Mark, that advice could shape the next chapter of the entire build. The story of Mark McCann's Mansory Bugatti becomes even more interesting when you understand just how unusual the car was before he took control of it. Most people who dream about owning a Bugatti Veyron imagine a perfect machine sitting inside a private garage, polished, complete, and ready to start at the push of a button. Mark's Veyron was almost the complete opposite. When he found it, the Hypercar had already spent years in a strange state of unfinished restoration. It had been moved between garages, separated into pieces, and left with a long list of problems that needed to be solved before anyone could even think about enjoying it properly. That made the purchase a huge risk from the beginning. Mark was not simply buying a $1 million car. He was buying a problem that happened to wear a Bugatti badge. The car had originally been a standard Veyron, but Mansory had transformed it in 2008 to give a look inspired by the rare Persang. That meant the machine already had an unusual history before Mark ever saw it. Mansory added major carbon fiber features and changed the exterior, creating a Veyron that was visually far removed from a normal factory example. The work was estimated to have cost more than $440,000, which helps explain why the finished car was so different from an ordinary Veyron. But those changes also create a question that would follow the car for years. Did the modifications make it more valuable or less valuable? For some collectors, a rare Mansory conversion could make the car more interesting because it is different from anything else. For others, the fact that it is not a genuine factory Persang could make it less desirable than an untouched original. Mark therefore had to think about two different kinds of value. There was a financial value, which could change depending on the market and the condition of the car, and there was a personal value that came from owning something almost nobody else had. That became especially important because the restoration itself was so expensive. A gearbox replacement was one of the biggest concerns, and there were many smaller problems hiding around the car. Missing hardware may sound like a simple issue on a normal vehicle, but on a machine as complex as a Veyron, even small missing parts can create major delays. Damaged aluminum panels and an aging interior added more work. The exterior created another layer of difficulty because not every part that appeared to be carbon fiber was actually carbon fiber. Some sections were covered in vinyl wrap, and that wrap was already in poor condition. Restoring the appearance, therefore, required more than simply cleaning the car. Mark and the specialists working on it had to figure out what was original, what had been changed, what needed replacement, and what could be saved. That is why the project became such a strong story for his YouTube audience. Every time the team solved one problem, another question could appear. The car was so complex that there was no easy checklist that could guarantee success. Mark had to keep making decisions based on the condition of the parts in front of him. He also needed specialists who understood the vehicle, which is why the project involved Falongers, a workshop known for its experience with Bugatti vehicles. According to the script, the workshop service stamps carry significant importance among owners of these cars, making a valuable choice for a restoration of this level. The financial side made every decision more serious. Early estimates placed a complete restoration somewhere between about $315,000 and $375,000, but the bill could potentially climb much higher if more damaged or missing components needed to be replaced. In the worst case described in the script, the restoration could reach around $750,000. Add that to the purchase price, and Mark could have nearly $1.9 million tied up in the car. That is an enormous amount of money for a project whose final market value is not completely clear. Yet the risk also created something valuable for Mark, a story. Every stage of the rebuild could be filmed, explained, and shared with viewers. Instead of being only an expensive repair, the Veyron became a major part of his YouTube journey. His audience could watch the car move from a collection of separated parts toward a complete hypercar. That made the project unusual because the car had value in two worlds. It had value as a rare machine, but it also had value as content. The more people became interested in the rebuild, the more the project could support itself through attention. Still, none of that guaranteed success. A video audience cannot magically fix a gearbox, restore damaged aluminum, or solve the question of collector value. Mark still had to finish the physical work. And once the car finally came together, there was one person whose opinion could provide a completely different kind of answer. That person was Mansory. Mark had spent years working on a car that carried the Mansory name, so taking it back to the company was almost like returning a finished project to its original designer. He could have simply kept the Veyron at home and enjoyed it. Instead, he wanted to see what Mansory thought. That decision created the most important moment in the entire story, because now the car was no longer being judged only by Mark, his team, or online viewers. It was being looked at by the man behind the transformation itself. After everything the Veyron had survived, the question was no longer whether Mark could rebuild it. The question was whether he had rebuilt it in a way that respected what made the car special in the first place. When Mark finally returned the Veyron to Mansory, the mood around the car changed. For years, the project had been about fixing problems, finding parts, dealing with mechanical issues, and trying to bring a badly separated hypercar back together. Now Mark had reached a different stage. The car could finally be looked at as a finished creation instead of a broken project. But that did not mean the work was over. In fact, the visit to Mansory revealed that one of the most important decisions about the car had not been solved at all. The problem was sitting right on the outside of the vehicle. The Veyron's polished bare aluminum body looked special because it was different from the normal painted finish seen on most supercars. It gave the car a raw, almost industrial appearance, while also connecting it to the unusual Mansory transformation. But that same aluminum was creating a serious headache. After the surface was polished, it would begin to develop a cloudy oxidation effect again after only a few hours. Mark had a simple idea. If the aluminum kept becoming difficult to maintain, why not wrap the car in red and hide the problem? From a practical point of view, the idea made sense. A red exterior could completely change the appearance, cover the cloudy surface, and make the car easier to keep looking clean. But Mansory did not agree. He strongly advised Mark not to cover the original finish. His reason was simple. The aluminum was part of what made this Veyron special. Changing it could remove some of the character that separated the car from an ordinary customized vehicle. It was an important moment because Mark was now hearing advice from the person who had helped create the car's identity in the first place. He could have ignored that advice and done whatever he wanted. After all, it was his car and he was the one paying the bills. But the visit gave him another way to look at the problem. Instead of asking, "How can I hide this?" he now had to ask, "How can I protect this while keeping original?" That is a much harder question. The team began considering different ways to protect the aluminum without changing its appearance. Anodizing was one possible option. A protective lacquer was another. Paint protection film, or PPF, was also being considered. Each method offered a possible solution, but none came with a simple promise that the oxidation problem would disappear forever. The good news was that Mark had an advantage that most owners would never have. Mansory had kept spare panels from the car for 18 years. Those original pieces could now become test parts. Instead of experimenting directly on the body of the Veyron and risking permanent damage, the team could try different methods on the spare panels first. That gave them a safer way to learn what worked. It also showed why the history of this particular car mattered so much. These were not random replacement panels. They were pieces connected to the original Mansory work, kept for years and suddenly becoming useful again. For Mark, the visit was therefore more than a chance to show off the finished Veyron. It became a lesson in preservation. He had already learned how difficult it was to rebuild a machine. Now he was learning that owning a rare hypercar also means making careful choices about what not to change. The conversation about the exterior also opened the door to another idea, the interior. Mark wanted to give the cabin a fresh look, and he considered a bright blue color. Unlike the exterior wrap idea, this change received a more positive response. Mansory approved of the blue idea and even suggested orange as another possible option. That small moment says a lot about the difference between modifying something and destroying its character. Changing the interior could allow Mark to make the car feel more personal without hiding one of the most important features of its original exterior design. The advice, therefore, gave him a clearer path. Keep the special aluminum exterior visible. Find a smart way to protect it, and use the interior as a place where more personal choices can be made. For Mark, the visit also changed his view of Mansory itself. Before spending time inside the company's facilities, he already had opinions about the brand. But seeing the work closely gave him a deeper appreciation for the design and engineering involved in creating highly customized cars. Instead of viewing Mansory simply as a company that makes cars look more extreme, he came away seeing a deeper level of skill and creativity behind the work. That matters because the Veyron was not simply wearing a Mansory badge. Its entire identity had been shaped by the company. Mark had spent years rebuilding that identity, and now the people behind it were helping him understand how to preserve it. The Mansory visit also gives the story a larger lesson about owning rare and expensive cars. From the outside, a Bugatti Veyron can look like the ultimate symbol of success. It has the price, the performance, the history, and the presence that make people stop and stare. But Mark's experience shows what can happen when one of these cars becomes a restoration project. The purchase price is only one part of the cost. Maintenance, specialist work, rare parts, body repairs, mechanical problems, and even cosmetic details can quickly turn ownership into a major project. Mark's Veyron was especially difficult because it had already been modified by Mansory. That made it more unusual, but it also made the car harder to compare with normal Veyrons. The machine was no longer a simple factory product. It had become its own special version with its own history. That history was part of its value, but it also meant that Mark had to think carefully before making major changes. The polished aluminum is a perfect example. On a normal car, if the owner does not like the finish, they can paint it, wrap it, or replace it. On a rare Mansory Veyron, a change like that could affect the character of the entire vehicle. Kourosh Mansory's advice therefore mattered, because it came from someone who understood why the car looked the way it did. His warning against wrapping the exterior was not simply about appearance. It was about keeping the unusual identity that had been created years earlier. Mark still had to solve the oxidation problem, but now he had a better reason to search for a solution that would protect rather than hide the aluminum. That is what makes the final stage of this restoration different from the beginning. At first, the goal was simple: get the car back together. The Veyron needed to move from a collection of damaged and missing pieces into a functioning vehicle. But once that goal was achieved, the questions became more complicated. How do you preserve it? How do you improve it without changing its history? How much should you personalize it? And perhaps most importantly, when does an improvement actually become a mistake? Those questions are interesting because they apply to almost every serious collector car project. A restoration is not always about making a car look brand new. Sometimes it is about protecting the things that make it unique. Mark's journey also shows why rare cars can become emotional projects. If this were only about money, it would be easy to sell the Veyron and walk away. But after spending years rebuilding it, Mark had a connection to the car that went beyond its price. He had seen it when it was in pieces. He had dealt with the problems. He had watched specialists work on it. He had put money and time into bringing it back. By the time he returned to Mansory, the car represented a long personal journey. That is why getting Kourosh Mansory's opinion mattered. It was almost like taking a final exam after years of work. Mark wanted to know whether the finished product respected the original vision. The answer was not simply yes or no. Instead, Mansory's reaction gave him guidance about what should happen next. The exterior should be preserved. The aluminum needed a proper protection method. The interior could be personalized. And the original character of the vehicle needed to remain at the center of every decision. That is a much more useful result than a simple compliment. It gives Mark a direction for the next stage of the project. The Veyron may have reached the end of its rebuild, but it has not reached the end of its story. There is still a problem to solve, and that problem could determine how the car looks for years to come. Mark now has to test the different protection methods. Find one that can slow or stop the oxidation, and make sure the solution does not damage the original panels. At the same time, he can decide how far he wants to go with the interior. Blue could give the cabin a fresh personality, while orange would make it even more dramatic. Those choices may sound small compared with replacing a Veyron gearbox, but on a collector car, small choices can have a big effect. Every part tells a story, and every change becomes part of the car's future history. In the end, the most surprising part of Mark McCann's Mansory Veyron story may not be the huge purchase price, the difficult rebuild, or even the meeting with Kourosh Mansory. It may be the fact that after all the money and work spent bringing the car back, one of the biggest challenges was simply deciding how to leave it alone. Mark had already shown that he was willing to take on a project most people would have avoided. He bought a Veyron that had been sitting disassembled, accepted the risk of a massive restoration bill, worked through mechanical and cosmetic problems, and eventually brought the car back into a condition where it could return to the road and continue its life. But once the machine was restored, the next challenge was more subtle. Mark had to resist the natural temptation to keep changing things. The red wrap idea was attractive because it could hide the oxidation, but Mansory's advice made him stop and think. The aluminum was not simply a difficult surface. It was part of the car's identity. Covering it might solve one problem, while creating another. That is an important lesson with any rare vehicle. Sometimes the best modification is the one you decide not to make. Mark's meeting with Kourosh Mansory also changed his relationship with the brand. Before the visit, he had his own opinions about Mansory, but after seeing the facilities and speaking with the company's founder, he came away with a stronger appreciation for the work. He saw the design and engineering involved in creating unusual vehicles